Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little stabby, but in a calm way. A very quiet, historically questionable, softly unsettling kind of way. So, if you can, dim the lights a bit, maybe lie down. Let your brain slow down just enough that medieval poor life choices start to feel oddly comforting, because tonight, we're drifting into the daily life of a medieval assassin, not the cool, rooftop-leaping, perfectly dressed kind. Not the dramatic whisper in the ear before the final blow kind either. No, we're talking about the real version. The one with bad shoes, worse hygiene, and the constant, low-level fear of being stabbed first. So just settle in, and let's begin. Our story doesn't start with a dramatic oath, or a secret society, or even a particularly cool nickname. It starts, as most medieval stories do, with someone being born into a situation that was already not ideal. Let's imagine a young man. We'll call him Thomas. Not because it's important, but because medieval Europe had approximately 12 names, and Thomas was doing a lot of heavy lifting. Thomas is born sometime in the 13th century. His village smells faintly of smoke, livestock, and regret. His family is not wealthy. In fact, not wealthy is doing a lot of kindness here. They are poor, quietly, consistently poor. His daily life, before any assassin business begins, is mostly about survival. He wakes up early, eats something that barely qualifies as food, works in a field that probably belongs to someone else, and goes to bed tired, dirty, and still somehow hungry. So naturally, becoming an assassin starts to sound like a career upgrade. Now, to be clear, there wasn't exactly a sign-up sheet labeled assassin jobs to apply here. Medieval assassination was less of a profession and more of a side hustle with consequences. Sometimes you were hired, sometimes you were pressured, sometimes you made one bad decision, and suddenly you were the guy who handles things. And Thomas, unfortunately, is about to become that guy. Let's float gently into the moment everything changes. Thomas is maybe in his late teens, which, in medieval terms, basically means he's already lived a full life, and should probably have 3 children by now. One evening, he's approached by someone slightly better dressed than him, which, again, is not saying much. But this man has shoes that match, and in medieval society, that's basically aristocracy. The man doesn't introduce himself properly. Of course he doesn't. That would be too normal. Instead, he talks in vague terms, mentions a problem, mentions a person, mentions that solving this problem could result in Thomas having money. Now, money is a powerful motivator, especially when your current financial plan is hope the crops don't fail again. So Thomas listens. He probably doesn't fully understand what's being asked. Or maybe he does, and just chooses not to think about it too hard. Either way, he nods, because of course he does, and just like that, he's in. Now, here's where things get slightly less glamorous. There is no training montage. No one teaches Thomas how to sneak dramatically through shadows. No one hands him a sleek, custom-made blade. There's no wise mentor explaining the philosophy of quiet violence. Instead, Thomas is given very basic instructions. Watch the target, learn their routine, wait for the right moment, and try not to get caught. That's it. That's the entire training program, which is concerning. So Thomas begins his new daily routine, and honestly, it's mostly waiting. A lot of medieval assassination was just standing around, pretending to be busy, watching someone from a distance, trying to look like you belong somewhere you absolutely do not belong. Thomas spends hours observing his target, Maybe it's a minor noble. Maybe it's a merchant who upset the wrong person. Medieval grudges were surprisingly flexible. He notes when the target leaves their house, when they return, who they talk to, whether they have guards. And here's the thing, this is not exciting. It's slow. It's boring. It's deeply uncomfortable, because while Thomas is doing all this, he's also very aware that if anyone notices him being too interested, things could go badly, very quickly. Let's take a moment to appreciate the stress level here. Thomas is not a trained spy. He's not particularly stealthy. He's just a guy trying very hard to look like he's not doing something incredibly suspicious, which means he probably overthinks everything. Am I standing too still? Did that person just look at me? Why is that dog staring at me like that? Medieval dogs, by the way, were not helpful in these situations. Eventually, after days, or maybe weeks of observation, Thomas identifies what he believes is the perfect moment, and by perfect, we mean slightly less terrible than all the other options. Maybe the target walks alone at dusk. Maybe there's a narrow street. Maybe there are fewer witnesses. This is as good as it gets. So Thomas prepares. Preparation, again, is not glamorous. He checks his weapon, which is probably just a basic knife. Not especially sharp. Definitely not elegant. He makes sure he's not wearing anything too noticeable, which, in medieval fashion, is actually quite easy, because most people look like variations of the same slightly worn-out outfit. He takes a deep breath, and then he waits again, because timing is everything, and also because hesitation is very real. Now, we're not going to focus on the actual act itself, not because it didn't happen, but because our goal here is sleep, not shock. So let's just say, it happens quickly, or at least, Thomas hopes it does, and then, immediately, the focus shifts to something arguably more stressful, getting away. Escaping is where things often went wrong, because medieval towns were not designed for clean getaways. Streets were narrow, people were everywhere, and everyone knew everyone. So Thomas has to move quickly, but not too quickly. He has to look normal, but not too normal. He has to disappear, without drawing attention to the fact that he's disappearing, which is, frankly, a lot to ask of someone who was farming potatoes a few weeks ago. If he's lucky, he blends into the crowd. If he's unlucky, well, let's not dwell on that. Instead, let's assume he makes it out. He returns to wherever he's staying, which is probably not a luxurious safe house. More likely, it's the same modest, slightly uncomfortable place he's always known, and then he waits again, because payment doesn't always come immediately, and trust, in this line of work, is limited. Eventually, he receives something, coins, maybe a small pouch, enough to feel significant, but not enough to completely change his life, because of course it isn't. Medieval systems were very good at keeping people exactly where they were. So now Thomas faces a quiet, slightly unsettling realization. He did it, and he got away with it, which means he might be asked to do it again. And here's where things get a little strange, because once you've crossed that line, the world doesn't suddenly transform. There's no dramatic shift in lighting, no music cue. Life just continues. Thomas still wakes up, still eats, still exists in the same slightly uncomfortable world. But now, there's an extra layer, a kind of quiet tension, because he knows something about himself that he didn't know before. And maybe, he's not entirely sure how to feel about it. Let's gently drift to the idea of reputation. In medieval society, word traveled, slowly, but surely. People talked, and sometimes, without saying it directly, Thomas might start to notice subtle changes. A look here, a whisper there, nothing obvious, nothing you could point to and say, "Ah yes, that's definitely about me," but enough to create a feeling, a sense that maybe people know, or at least suspect. And that's the thing about being a medieval assassin. It's not just the act itself, it's everything around it. The waiting, the watching, the worrying, the constant balancing act between being invisible and being useful. So Thomas continues, because what else is he going to do? Go back to farming and pretend none of this happened? That would be complicated. And besides, the money, while not life-changing, is still better than what he had before. So he stays in this strange, quiet role, half-ordinary person, have something else entirely. And as we slowly settle deeper into this world, we'll start to see that Thomas is not unique. Not really. There were others like him. Different names, different places, same basic story. People pulled into a life that was less about dramatic heroics and more about quiet, persistent unease. But for now, we'll let Thomas rest, because even medieval assassins needed sleep. And honestly, after a day of pretending not to be suspicious, while being extremely suspicious, he probably deserved it. In the next part, we'll drift a little further, maybe into the lives of those who hired men like Thomas, because, as it turns out, the people giving the orders were often far more complicated, and sometimes far more ridiculous. But we'll get to that slowly. For now, just let your mind wander a bit. Alright, welcome back. If you're still here, still comfortably drifting somewhere between awake and asleep, then you're doing this exactly right. Maybe you've shifted position a little. Maybe the blanket situation has improved. Hopefully, your brain has started to slow down just enough that medieval decision-making doesn't feel quite so alarming. Because tonight, or rather, continuing tonight, we're gently floating away from Thomas for a moment. He's fine, probably, still doing his thing. Still trying not to look suspicious, while being deeply suspicious. But now, let's drift over to the other side of this arrangement. The people who hire assassins, because, as it turns out, they are rarely the calm, rational masterminds you might expect. In fact, more often than not, they are tired, petty, overly emotional individuals with too much power and not nearly enough patience. Let's imagine one. We'll call him Lord Geoffrey, not because it matters, but because Geoffrey feels like the kind of name that comes with a necessary confidence and at least one questionable decision per week. Lord Geoffrey is, technically, important. He owns land. He has a title. He probably has a chair that's slightly more decorative than everyone else's chair. And yet, despite all this, he's not particularly happy, because medieval nobility had a special talent for being deeply dissatisfied with things that were, objectively, already quite good. Geoffrey wakes up each day in a reasonably comfortable bed. He eats better food than most people around him. He has servants. And still, something is bothering him. Maybe it's a rival noble. Maybe it's a business dispute. Maybe someone said something mildly insulting 3 months ago, and he's been thinking about it ever since. Medieval grudges, as we mentioned before, had remarkable staying power. So Geoffrey does what many powerful people throughout history have done. When faced with a problem, he refuses to handle it directly. Instead, he decides that someone else should remove the problem, quietly, conveniently, preferably without making things awkward at the next social gathering. Now, here's where things get a bit impractical, because hiring someone like Thomas is not as simple as placing an order. There's no official process, no standard pricing, no customer service, just a series of slightly uncomfortable conversations with people who may or may not be trustworthy. Geoffrey, being Geoffrey, probably thinks he's being very clever. He speaks in vague terms, uses phrases like take care of it or handle the situation, as if this adds a layer of sophistication. In reality, it mostly adds confusion, because the person he's talking to is just trying to figure out exactly how much trouble they're agreeing to. Eventually, though, an understanding is reached. Money is discussed, not openly, of course. That would be too straightforward. Instead, it's hinted at, suggested, implied through awkward pauses and meaningful looks. Medieval negotiations were not efficient. Once the arrangement is made, Geoffrey returns to his daily life. And this is where things get quietly strange, because while Thomas is out there, waiting, watching, worrying, Geoffrey is attending dinners, discussing crops, complaining about minor inconveniences, all while knowing that, somewhere, something is being set in motion. You might expect him to feel intense guilt, or anxiety, or at least a slight sense of moral hesitation, but more often than not, it's something much simpler. Impatience. Geoffrey wants results. He wants the problem gone, preferably soon, because waiting is inconvenient, and inconvenience, to someone like Geoffrey, is almost worse than danger. So he starts to wonder, is it done yet? Why hasn't anything happened? Did I hire the right person? Should I have been more specific? And here's the slightly ironic part. Geoffrey, who has decided to solve his problem in the most indirect and risky way possible, is now frustrated by the lack of immediate results. Because of course he is. Let's gently pause here and consider the level of coordination involved. On one side, you have Thomas, trying very hard not to be noticed, carefully observing patterns, waiting for the right moment. On the other side, you have Geoffrey, sitting in a comfortable room, wondering why things aren't happening faster. It's not exactly a well-synchronized system. Eventually, of course, something does happen, and news begins to spread, slowly, through whispers, through conversations that start with, "Have you heard?" Geoffrey hears it too, but he doesn't react immediately, because reacting immediately would be suspicious, and Geoffrey, for all his questionable decisions, does understand the importance of not looking directly involved. So he waits, he listens, he pretends to be mildly surprised, maybe even a little concerned. Really, that's unfortunate. You can almost hear him say it, in that slightly detached tone people use when something has gone exactly as they hoped, but they need to pretend otherwise. And then, life continues, because that's how it works. The problem is gone, the world adjusts, and Geoffrey moves on to whatever is bothering him next, which, to be honest, is probably something equally minor, because once you've solved one problem this way, it becomes an option, a very questionable option, but an option nonetheless. Now, not all employers were like Geoffrey. Some were more cautious, more nervous, occasionally even regretful, but the general pattern remained the same. A problem, a decision, a quiet arrangement, and then waiting. Let's drift a little further, because there's another layer to this. The social circle. Geoffrey does not exist in isolation. He has peers, other nobles, other people with similar levels of comfort, and similar tendencies toward overreaction. And sometimes, these people talk, not directly, of course. No one says, "I hired someone to solve my problem." That would be far too obvious. Instead, they speak in hints, in shared understandings, in that very specific tone that suggests more is being said than what is actually being said. Things have been quieter lately. Some situations resolve themselves. It's amazing how quickly circumstances can change, and everyone nods, because everyone understands. At least, they think they do. This creates a kind of atmosphere, a quiet acceptance that certain problems are handled in certain ways, not openly acknowledged, but not entirely hidden either. And in this atmosphere, people like Thomas continue to exist, moving quietly through the edges of society, doing work that is both in demand and never officially recognized. Now, let's take a softer turn, because not every story ends cleanly. Not every plan goes smoothly. Sometimes, things get complicated. Maybe the wrong person is seen at the wrong time. Maybe someone talks when they shouldn't. Maybe Thomas has an off day, which, in this line of work, is particularly unfortunate. And when that happens, Jeffrey's calm, controlled world starts to feel a little less stable, because suddenly there's a risk, a connection, a possibility that things might trace back to him. And Jeffrey does not like that, not at all. So he becomes cautious, more reserved, maybe even a little paranoid. He pays closer attention to conversations, watches reactions more carefully, tries to assess whether anyone knows anything. And here's the interesting part. This anxiety, it lingers, because once you've made a decision like this, you can't really undo it. You can only hope it stays quiet. So Jeffrey continues his life, attends his dinners, manages his land, maintains his position. But now, there's a subtle shift, a small, persistent awareness that somewhere, in the background, there are things he cannot fully control, and that, for someone like Jeffrey, is deeply uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Thomas continues as well, moving from one task to another, one quiet arrangement to the next. Their lives, in a strange way, are connected, not through friendship, not through loyalty, but through a shared understanding. One gives the orders, the other carries them out, and neither of them is entirely at ease. So as we slowly let this part come to rest, you might notice something. This world of medieval assassination, it's not dramatic, it's not glamorous, it's mostly people making slightly questionable decisions and then living with them quietly. In the next part, we'll drift back toward Thomas and take a closer look at his daily routine, because once this becomes your life, there are habits, patterns. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little unusual, not dramatic, not fast-paced, definitely not heroic, just quietly strange. So, if you can, dim the lights a bit. Maybe adjust your pillow, let your shoulders drop. Because tonight, we're not diving into epic battles or glorious kings. We're drifting into something much softer, and somehow a bit more uncomfortable. Tonight, we're talking about how people became assassins, not the movie version, not the stylish, confident, perfectly trained version, but the real, slow, slightly awkward process, where ordinary people just sort of ended up there. Let's start with something important. No one, in medieval times, woke up one morning and said, "You know what? I'd love to pursue a long-term career in quiet, secretive murder." That wasn't a thing. There were no schools for it. No guilds proudly advertising their services. No family saying, "Oh yes, your grandfather was a baker, your father was a blacksmith, and you shall be an assassin." It didn't work like that. Instead, it was usually a series of small, slightly bad decisions, and occasionally, one very bad decision. So let's imagine someone, we'll call him Martin. Again, not because the name matters, but because medieval naming trends were limited. If you shouted Martin in a crowded town, at least 4 people would look up, mildly confused. Martin is not special. That's the key detail. He's not particularly strong, not especially clever, not secretly noble. He's just there, living in a town that smells faintly of mud, smoke, and livestock that has seen better days. His life is predictable. Wake up early, eat something simple, work, rest, repeat. And here's the thing about predictable lives. They can feel safe, but they can also feel stuck. Martin doesn't necessarily dream of adventure. He's not standing in fields, imagining himself as a shadowy figure moving through the night. No, he's mostly thinking about food, about money, about whether winter is going to be particularly unpleasant this year, which, statistically, it probably is. Now, here's where things begin to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a small change. A conversation. One evening, Martin finds himself in a place where people talk a little more freely. Maybe it's a tavern. Maybe it's just a shared space where people gather to complain about life in a slightly more social way. And there, he overhears something. Not a full plan. Not a detailed discussion. Just fragments. Someone mentions a problem. Someone else mentions a person. And then, almost casually, someone says, there are ways to deal with that. Now, most people would hear that and ignore it, or at least pretend to ignore it, because getting involved in other people's problems, especially the kind that require dealing with, is generally not a great idea. But Martin listens, not because he's particularly interested, but because he's curious, and curiosity, in medieval life, is not always your friend. Over time, these conversations happen again. Not the same people, not the same details, but the same general idea. Problems, solutions, people who handle things quietly and slowly, almost without realizing it. Martin becomes aware of something. There is a world, just slightly beneath the surface. A world where things are handled differently. Now, at this point, Martin is still very much a normal person. He's not involved. He's just aware. But awareness has a way of leading to opportunity. Or, depending on how you look at it, trouble. Let's gently move forward. One day, Martin is approached. Not dramatically. No cloaks. No secret signals. Just a person, standing a little too close. Speaking a little too quietly. The conversation is vague, because of course it is. Have you ever needed extra coin? Now, this is not a complicated question. The answer, for almost everyone in medieval society, is yes. Always yes. Martin nods, because pretending he doesn't need money would be both unrealistic and unnecessary. The person continues, there are ways to earn it, and here's the moment. The small, quiet moment where things could go in different directions. Martin could walk away. He could say no. He could decide that whatever this is, it's not worth it. But he doesn't. Not because he's reckless, not because he's eager, but because he's tired. Tired of the same routine. Tired of not having enough. Tired of feeling like nothing ever changes. So he listens, and the person explains just enough. There's someone. They've caused problems. Someone else would prefer those problems to stop. No details, no names, just a general situation. And then, finally, the offer. If you help, you'll be paid. Now, here's the important part. Martin doesn't immediately say yes. He hesitates, because, even without full details, he understands, at least partially. This is not normal work. This is not something you can casually explain later. But then he thinks about his current situation, about the constant effort, the lack of reward, and slowly, the hesitation fades. All right, he says, not confidently, not dramatically, just quietly. And just like that, he's taken the first step. Now, you might expect some kind of preparation, some training, some guidance. But no, instead, Martin is given very simple instructions. Watch, wait, learn. That's it. No one teaches him how to move silently. No one shows him how to blend into shadows. No one hands him a specially crafted weapon, because medieval life was not particularly organized. So Martin begins, and what he discovers is that becoming an assassin is mostly about patience, He spends days watching someone, trying not to be noticed, trying not to look like he's watching, which is harder than it sounds, because when you're trying not to look suspicious, you often end up looking extremely suspicious. He stands in places where he doesn't quite belong, walks routes that don't quite make sense, pretends to be busy, and all the while, he's thinking, is this worth it? Am I doing this right? Does that person know I'm here? It's not glamorous, it's not exciting, it's mostly uncomfortable, but he continues, because at this point, turning back feels just as complicated as moving forward. Eventually, he starts to understand patterns. When the person leaves their home, where they go, who they meet, and slowly, the situation becomes clearer. Not morally clearer, just practically clearer. He knows what he's supposed to do, and that knowledge sits with him, quietly. For a while, nothing happens, because waiting is a big part of this process. Waiting for the right moment, waiting for a fewer people, waiting for something that feels manageable. And during this time, Martin continues his normal life. He still works, still eats, still interacts with people. But now, there's something else in the background, a constant awareness, a quiet pressure, because he knows that eventually he will have to act. And when that moment comes, it won't feel dramatic. It will feel strangely ordinary. A decision made in a quiet space, a quick action, and then movement, away from the situation, back into the world. And that's the strange part, because after everything, life continues. There's no announcement, no recognition, just a quiet return to normal. Except, it's not quite normal anymore, because Martin has crossed the line. And once you cross that line, it doesn't disappear. It stays with you, in small ways, in quiet moments. And sometimes, it leads to more work. Because once people know you're willing to do something like this, they remember, and they ask again. Not directly, not openly, but the opportunities appear. And Martin finds himself in a position he never planned for. Not a hero, not a villain, just a person who made a choice, and then kept making it. So as we slowly let this first part settle, you might notice something. Becoming an assassin was not a single moment. It was a process, a gradual shift from ordinary life into something quietly different. And in the next part, we'll drift a little deeper into the habits, the routines, the small, everyday details that define this very unusual life. Because once you become this kind of person, your days start to change. Not dramatically, but just enough to feel different. And we'll explore that slowly. For now, just relax. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soft, slow, and just a little uncomfortable in a very calm way. So if you can, dim the lights. Maybe put your phone a little further away. Rest your head properly, and let your breathing settle into that slow rhythm, where thoughts don't rush anymore. Because tonight, we're drifting into a world built on fear, shaped by failure, and quietly held together by punishment. Not dramatic, not loud, just constant, like a background hum that people eventually stopped noticing, even though it never really went away. And as you lie there, getting comfortable, just imagine a medieval town, not the shiny version, not the one with heroic music and cinematic lighting, but the real one. Slightly uneven roads, buildings leaning just a little too much, the air carrying a mix of smoke, damp wood, and something you don't want to think about too closely. And in that town lives someone very ordinary, because of course they are. Almost everyone was ordinary, and we'll call him Peter, not because it matters, but because if you walked through a medieval street and called out, Peter, at least 3 people would turn around, and one of them would probably sigh. Now Peter wakes up early, not because he's motivated, not because he has a passion for productivity, but because the world he lives in does not really allow sleeping in. The day begins when it begins, and you either follow along or you fall behind. And falling behind, in Peter's world, is not a motivational quote situation. It's a very real problem. So he wakes up, slowly, probably still tired, because rest was never quite enough, and his first feeling is not ambition, not excitement. It's something quieter, a low, steady awareness, a kind of background fear that sits with him before he even fully opens his eyes. Because Peter knows something very simple. Life is not stable. Not really. Things can go wrong, quickly and without much warning. And when they do, there isn't always a safety net waiting to catch you. And so his day begins, like most days, with small careful steps. Not literal steps, but choices. How he speaks, how he works, how he interacts with people around him. Because every small action carries a kind of weight, not a dramatic weight, just enough to matter. And this is where fear quietly shapes everything. Not the loud, panicked kind, but the steady kind. The kind that teaches you what not to do long before you even consider doing it. Peter doesn't take risks, not because he lacks imagination, but because imagination in a place like this often leads to problems. And problems lead to attention, and attention is not always good. So he works carefully, speaks carefully, exists carefully, and around him, everyone else is doing the same thing. A whole town of people quietly adjusting themselves to avoid mistakes, because mistakes are not just personal failures here. They have consequences, and those consequences are rarely gentle. And normal things don't always feel strange, even when they probably should. So Peter continues his routine, working, resting, speaking, staying within the boundaries that have been quietly set for him. And as he moves through the day, that low, steady fear remains, not overwhelming, not paralyzing, just present, guiding his decisions in small, almost invisible ways. And around him, the same pattern repeats. Different people, different roles, but the same underlying rhythm. Fear, caution, adjustment, and occasionally, failure, followed by consequences that remind everyone else to be just a little more careful. And as evening approaches, Peter begins to slow down, not dramatically, just naturally. The light fades, the activity quiets, and the world becomes a little softer. And in these moments, there's a kind of calm, not because the fear is gone, but because it's less active, less immediate, more like a distant presence than something pressing close. And maybe, just for a moment, Peter feels something like relief, a small pause in the constant awareness, a chance to simply exist without thinking too much about what could go wrong. And then, gradually, he prepares to rest, not with excitement for the next day, but with acceptance, because tomorrow will be similar. The same patterns, the same careful movements, the same quiet balance between avoiding failure and staying unnoticed. And as he lies down, that background hum of fear doesn't disappear. It just softens, settling into the edges of his thoughts as sleep slowly takes over. And in that quiet transition, you start to understand something. This world wasn't loud and chaotic all the time. It was often quiet, controlled, shaped by small, consistent pressures that guided people without needing constant force. And as we gently move forward from here, we'll start to see how this system didn't just affect ordinary people like Peter, but also those at the very top, the kings, the nobles, the ones who seemed powerful but were often just as trapped in their own quiet fears, their own strange habits, their own slightly ridiculous decisions. And we'll drift into that next, slowly, without rushing, just letting the story continue to unfold in that same calm, steady way. And normal things don't always feel strange, even when they probably should. So Peter continues his routine, working, resting, speaking, staying within the boundaries that have been quietly set for him, and as he moves through the day, that low, steady fear remains, not overwhelming, not paralyzing, just present, guiding his decisions in small, almost invisible ways. And around him, the same pattern repeats. Different people, different roles, but the same underlying rhythm. Fear, caution, adjustment, and occasionally, failure, followed by consequences that remind everyone else to be just a little more careful. And as evening approaches, Peter begins to slow down, not dramatically, just naturally. The light fades, the activity quiets, and the world becomes a little softer. And in these moments, there's a kind of calm, not because the fear is gone, but because it's less active, less immediate, more like a distant presence than something pressing close. And maybe, just for a moment, Peter feels something like relief, a small pause in the constant awareness, a chance to simply exist without thinking too much about what could go wrong. And then, gradually, he prepares to rest, not with excitement for the next day, but with acceptance, because tomorrow will be similar. The same patterns, the same careful movements, the same quiet balance between avoiding failure and staying unnoticed. And as he lies down, that background hum of fear doesn't disappear. It just softens, settling into the edges of his thoughts as sleep slowly takes over. And in that quiet transition, you start to understand something. This world wasn't loud and chaotic all the time. It was often quiet, controlled, shaped by small, consistent pressures that guided people without needing constant force. And as we gently move forward from here, we'll start to see how this system didn't just affect ordinary people like Peter, but also those at the very top, the kings, the nobles, the ones who seemed powerful but were often just as trapped in their own quiet fears, their own strange habits, their own slightly ridiculous decisions. And we'll drift into that next, slowly, without rushing, just letting the story continue to unfold in that same calm, steady way. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something slow, quiet, and just a little bit uncomfortable in that soft, thoughtful way. So if you can, dim the lights, settle into your bed, maybe adjust your pillow one more time until it finally feels right. And just let your mind loosen a little, because tonight we're drifting into a world that looks grand from a distance, but feels surprisingly miserable up close. And as you start to relax, just imagine a castle, not the perfect fairy tale version, but the real one. Cold stone walls, slightly damp corners, long echoing halls that always seem a bit too empty. And somewhere inside this castle, there's a person who, from the outside, seems to have everything. Power, wealth, status, and yet, their life is not quite what you'd expect. So let's meet one of them. We'll call him Prince Edward, not because it matters, but because there were many Edwards, and most of them had a complicated time being alive. And Edward is born into privilege, which sounds wonderful, until you realize that privilege in medieval, royal life often comes with a very specific kind of discomfort, because from the moment he exists, his life is no longer his own. It belongs to the kingdom, to the family, to expectations that were set long before he could even understand what expectations are. And as a child, Edward does not get a quiet, simple upbringing. There's no running freely through fields without supervision, no casual friendships that form naturally. Instead, everything is structured, observed, and quietly judged. How he walks, how he speaks, how he eats, even how he sits. Because of course someone is always watching. There's always a tutor, a servant, a noble, someone ready to notice if he does something slightly wrong. And this creates a very particular kind of childhood, one that is not necessarily loud or obviously painful, but consistently tense, like wearing slightly uncomfortable clothing that you can never quite adjust. And Edward grows up in this environment, learning early that mistakes are not just mistakes. They are reflections of his worth, his future, his role. And this is where the misery begins. Not dramatically, not all at once, just slowly, quietly, over time, because every action carries weight, and that weight never really goes away. Now, let's gently move forward as Edward becomes older, not free, not independent, just older within the same system. His education is thorough, of course. He learns languages, history, politics, all the things a future ruler is supposed to know. But learning, in his case, is not driven by curiosity. It's driven by necessity. He doesn't study because he wants to. He studies because he has to. Because one day, all of this information will be expected of him. And failing to understand, it is not really an option. And this creates another layer of quiet pressure. Because no matter how much he learns, there's always more. Always another expectation, another skill, another way he could improve. An improvement, in this world, is never quite enough. There's always someone better, someone stronger, someone more confident. And Edward is constantly aware of this, constantly comparing himself, even if no one says it out loud. And as he moves through his daily life, there are moments that should feel enjoyable. Feasts, gatherings, interactions with other nobles. But even these are not entirely comfortable, because every conversation has a purpose. Every interaction is slightly strategic. People are not just talking to him. They are evaluating him, considering his future, his alliances, his usefulness. And Edward knows this. He feels it in the way people speak, in the way they pause, in the way they choose their words carefully. And so even in moments that look social, there is a quiet isolation, because it's hard to relax when every word might matter. Now, let's slow down and look at something even more personal. Relationships. Because you might assume that someone like Edward would have meaningful connections, deep friendships, maybe even love. But the reality is complicated. Friendships are often influenced by status, by politics, by what each person represents, rather than who they are. And trust becomes something difficult to establish, because how do you know if someone likes you, or if they like your position, your future, your potential power? And so Edward learns to be careful, to keep parts of himself hidden, to maintain a certain distance, not because he wants to, but because it feels safer. And then there's marriage, which, in his case, is not a personal choice. It's an arrangement, a decision made based on alliances, benefits, long-term strategy. And Edward may meet the person he's supposed to marry. They may even be pleasant, but the relationship is built on expectation rather than connection. And that creates its own quiet discomfort, because even something as personal as partnership becomes another responsibility, another role to fulfill. And as time moves forward, Edward's life becomes more defined, more structured, more controlled. He has duties now, real responsibilities, decisions that affect others. And this is where the weight increases, because being in power does not mean being free. It means being constantly observed, constantly evaluated, constantly expected to be something stable, something strong, something reliable, even when he doesn't feel that way. And this leads to a kind of emotional strain that is not always visible, because Edward cannot easily express doubt, or fear, or uncertainty. Those things are not encouraged in someone of his position, so instead, he keeps them inside, maintaining the image that others expect, while quietly dealing with the reality that he is, at the end of the day, still just a person. Now, let's gently float into one of the more ironic parts of his life, comfort, because from the outside, Edward's life looks comfortable. He has food, shelter, resources, things that many people around him do not have. And yet, that comfort is not quite as comforting as it seems. The castle is cold, often literally. Stone walls do not hold warmth very well. Privacy is limited. There are always people around. Servants, guards, advisors. And being alone is not always an option. And even when he's alone, his thoughts are not exactly peaceful, because there is always something to consider, something to worry about, something that needs attention. And so the physical comfort does not translate into emotional ease. Instead, it becomes another layer of contrast, something that looks good from the outside, but feels incomplete on the inside. And as Edward continues through his life, this pattern remains. Expectations, responsibilities, quiet pressures, moments of calm that never fully settle. And slowly, over time, this creates a kind of underlying exhaustion, not dramatic burnout, not a sudden collapse, just a steady, ongoing tiredness, the kind that builds gradually and becomes part of the background. And what's interesting is that Edward may not even fully recognize it, because this is all he has ever known. This is normal. This is what life looks like for him. And so he continues, fulfilling his role, meeting expectations, maintaining the image, while quietly carrying the weight that comes with it. And as we let this part slowly come to rest, you might notice something. This kind of misery is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists, in the small details, in the daily routines, in the quiet moments where something feels slightly off but can't quite be explained. And in the next part, we'll gently drift to another figure, another life that, from the outside, seemed important, impressive even, but underneath, carried its own version of discomfort, its own set of quiet struggles. Because this pattern, this strange mix of privilege and unease, was not unique to Edward. It was surprisingly common, and we'll explore that, slowly,